Welcome to the Compounders Podcast, the anatomy of a multi-bagger. This podcast is an exploration of public company wealth creation stories. My name is Ben Claremont, and I'm the host of the show. The goal of this episode is to describe what you're going to hear over the rest of Season 1. We're excited to bring something different and additive to the podcast world. Thanks for being with us to start this journey.
All opinions expressed by your hosts and the podcast guests are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinion of Cove Street Capital or any affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not investment advice and should not be relied upon for any investment decisions. We are not recommending the purchase or sale of any securities. The hosts and guests may be beneficial owners of the securities discussed. You should not assume that the securities discussed are or will be profitable.
Before we dig in, a little more about me. I'm a principal and portfolio manager at Cove Street Capital. Cove Street is an $800 million long-only asset manager located in sunny El Segundo, California. Before joining Cove Street, I ran the blog called The Inoculated Investor from 2009 to 2011. I've spent the last 10 years at Cove Street, and in fact, Cove Street just celebrated its 10th anniversary. Over the last 5 years, I've been managing institutional money as well. The majority of my time is spent researching companies. Part of that is talking to management teams about a variety of topics. So, a podcast in which I talk to CEOs seems like it is firmly within my circle of competence. I had this idea for this podcast 2 years ago. It didn't make sense for us to start this podcast until I found the perfect partner in Bobby Kraft of SNN. Taking a step back, what is the goal of any podcast? Our approach is to educate listeners and expose them to great thinkers and leaders. Within that, we have two main goals. First, for listeners and the host to learn from the successes and failures of public company executives. Secondly, to allow listeners to be a fly on the wall for the real life conversations we have with management teams. Here's a small sample of the types of questions we will ask. 1, what does the M&A due diligence process really look like, and how do you assess cultural fit? 2, we hear all about these great corporate cultures, but how do you build one that doesn't lose its secret sauce as the company gets larger? 3rd, why are so many compounders run by families or owner-operators? For people not familiar with terms in the podcast title, let's start with some definitions. We want to avoid using too much jargon, so we're going to use a very simple definition for a compounder. The idea comes from the concept of compound interest. For our purposes, a compounder is a business whose success builds upon itself in a way that allows for exponential as opposed to linear growth. When that happens, it often leads the stock to be a multi-bagger, or one that appreciates to levels several times its original value. Hence, the subtitle for the podcast. We are well aware that the term compounder gets thrown around a lot, but trust me when I say that we're going to be digging deep into how companies actually compound capital over time. This podcast is going to be primarily focused on having discussions with great public company leaders, some of whom you've probably never even heard of. In addition to that, we're not going to follow a linear path in our conversations. We're not going to walk through the company's history or the executive's background. Instead, we're going to start at a pivotal moment in the company's history. In fact, we're going to learn about the people and the company through real life experiences. So a good question you might have in your mind right now is, why are we doing this? There are plenty of business podcasts out there. Let me try to answer that in a way that shows how we can be additive to what else is available. One of my friends who's in venture capital gave me a framework he uses when looking at any investment. The framework is why you, why us, why now? I happen to love that framework to analyze any new endeavor, but I'm going to modify it a bit to discuss why we are starting a podcast. So I'm going to go over why this podcast, why Cove Street, and why now. So first, why this podcast? There are plenty of podcasts about investing. There are also plenty of podcasts about how people build companies. What we're doing is we're combining the two. The idea is to build a holistic understanding of how public company executives compound shareholders' wealth over time. The topics covered will include how successful companies allocate capital, develop effective strategies, create high-performing cultures, and approach the softer sides of business building, including hiring, employee retention, and compensation. The goal is to incorporate the best of both worlds, both the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of great companies. To do that, we're standing on the shoulders of other great podcasts, such as How I Built This, Capital Allocators, and Invest Like the Best. We're taking the best practices from each to create something different. We want this podcast to be a complement rather than a substitute for these shows. So far, we've seen a great response from the companies we've reached out to. In fact, the first two guests you'll hear from are both Fortune 500 CEOs. That's not a bad start for a new podcast, but we're going to have a very eclectic mix of companies on the roster for season 1. We will likely have 10 to 12 episodes this season, but who knows, maybe we'll also have some bonus episodes. Second question is, why Cove Street? Cove Street has 3 pillars of its investment process: business, value, and people. Our sense is that understanding people is generally underappreciated by the investment community. So within the people assessment aspect of our process, corporate governance and understanding the motivations of management are key. As a result, the episodes you will hear are the exact conversations we are having every day with companies. To understand a company holistically, we always ask questions about strategy, margins and returns, capital allocation, culture, incentives, and relationships. So within this podcast, we hope to let people in on the conversations that they don't often have access to. We do that by replicating an aspect of our due diligence process. A lot of people may wonder, what kind of questions do investors ask CEOs outside of the public setting? What do investors focus on when they are not interested in short-term results? How can investors get management teams to talk about the issues that sell-side analysts and a lot of the financial press don't cover? It is true that in many cases, Cove Street will have relationships with these companies. Either these are companies we own in our portfolio or companies we owned in the past. You may look at that and say it's a bad thing because it will lead to a biased conversation. We think it's a major positive because it allows for a deeper, richer discussion. We will be very clear at the introduction of every episode if we are a shareholder or not. But in the end, the ultimate goal of this podcast is education. The third question is, why now? There's plenty of data out there that shows podcasts are exploding in terms of appeal. I've actually been fortunate enough to be on a number of podcasts myself. I really enjoy the format and the conversations. This is my chance to turn around the mic and ask the tough questions. We've also done some market research that shows that there's demand for a podcast like this one, a podcast that dives deep into how public companies compound wealth over time. We will for sure be using an investing lens as we talk to executives. However, corporate finance and capital allocation are not the only things that contribute to compounding. Our niche is that we're going to explore the financial side and the softer sides of business building. We recognize that there are a lot of podcasts out there that are focused on large companies that are household names, not on smaller companies that are on their way to becoming household names. Also, a lot of podcasts focus on tech, media, and consumer companies. Of course, we would love to talk to the CEO of Microsoft, but we think there's a lot to learn from a successful company in an industry that doesn't get a lot of press. That's especially true if the company has been able to go from a $50 million valuation to $1 billion plus valuation. In general, we're hoping to expose these companies and their leaders to a broader audience. But don't get me wrong, if Tim Cook of Apple or Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook want to come on the show, we're certainly not going to turn them down. I'd like to close out this preview with our 5 promises. First, to attempt to release podcasts at a regular cadence. We just ask that listeners understand that public company leaders can have periods when they can't devote time to doing outside podcasts, so there may be unavoidable lulls. Second, to try to find an eclectic group of executives from various industries who can help share the stories of how they built public companies. Third, to ask challenging questions about capital allocation and company building that these leaders have to reflect on before answering. Fourth, to not get so in the weeds of business nuances that we lose the broader perspective. And lastly, to focus on drawing out practical lessons and takeaways that anybody can benefit from. Before we leave, just a couple things to note. As we said, Cove Street will own some of the stocks of the companies that we're talking to, or will be former shareholders. In any case, we will always disclose the relationships we have. Secondly, 100% of our share of ad revenue will be donated to the Brzee Foundation. Brzee is an educational organization located in Koreatown in LA. This organization helps change the lives of young people in its neighborhood. My wife and I have been involved for years, and we've seen firsthand the impact Brzee has on the young people in the community. So if you like this podcast, give us a positive review, share it with your friends, or maybe even better, make a small donation to Brzee. That is BRESEE.org. As we release new episodes, we welcome your feedback. If you have any ideas for podcast guests, please send them our way. Warm intros are very much appreciated. Our email address is podcast@covestreetcapital.com. We hope that you add this podcast to the menu of shows you listen to, and we thank you for giving this new idea a try. You will be able to find this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find great podcast content. Also, the video will be available on Cove Street's website and SNN's YouTube channel. So please stay tuned for season 1 of the Compounders Podcast, The Anatomy of a Multibagger. Thanks again for listening. We're excited to have you join our new show.